Hello folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and once again we are bound for the final frontier, this time with a couple of very early examples of Star Trek fiction published way back in 1968. And then, like I often like to do on my channel here, is chat about some of the artwork that came along with those. So this is my second offering for the Summer of Trek, which is the 2023 edition of Book Trek. And that is a now annual BookTube event that was created by Vin over at Revenant Reads a couple of years ago now. And it's to celebrate Star Trek fiction. And so I'll leave a link to his announcement video in the description below. And you can have him tell you all about the Summer of Trek and Book Trek in general. And I'll also leave links to the channels for all of his command crew of co-hosts who are also covering Star Trek fiction on their channels all summer long. So I am not one of the co-hosts myself. I'm just a lifelong Star Trek fan who happens to have a BookTube channel now and likes to chat about Star Trek. So here I am. And a week or so ago, I did my first Book Trek video for this year. And in that, I covered the first Star Trek fiction ever published. And I'll leave a link to that video if you're interested down below. It's kind of a prequel to this one. But in that one, I covered two publications. One was the January 1967 edition Star Trek by Bantam Books, which were adaptations by James Blish of several of the first season Star Trek episodes. And the other publication was the Gold Key Comics Star Trek issue number 1, which was the very first original fiction ever based on Star Trek to be published. And that came out in July of 1967. So that video was so much fun, I've decided to do it again. And so I'm calling this video the Star Trek 2s for, I think, obvious reasons. And in this one, I'll be covering Star Trek II, the second adaptations collected by James Blish based on the original Star Trek episodes, again, from the first season. And that one came out in February of 1968. And then the next one we'll chat about here in this video will be Gold Key Comics Star Trek issue number 2, which was the second ever original fiction based on Star Trek to be published. And that came out in March of 1968. And so we'll take a look at that. And here we go. Now, like last time, I won't go into a lot of depth of the stories as Blish has adapted them in Star Trek II. I'll just go through the table of contents basically so you get an idea of what's in the book. But just to keep in mind that Blish wrote from scripts, and often not the final scripts, and very often early drafts of the scripts. So there are notable differences in the way he tells a story versus how you remember them from watching the episodes. But I'll just go through these here again to give you an idea of what is in the book. And the first story in the book is Arena. That, of course, is the famous first appearance of the Gorn, where Kirk confronts the Gorn on that desert planet there that was created as an arena. And that version of the Gorn is the very sluggish, slow-moving reptilian creature that is quite unlike the fast-moving CGI Gorn that we get in episodes created today. And even going back to Star Trek Enterprise, they had a quickly moving CGI created Gorn, which didn't look a whole lot like the Gorn that we grew up with. Second story is A Taste of Armageddon. That, of course, was a blatant violation of the Prime Directive. The Enterprise goes to a planet where they are killing their population off through a computer war that they're playing. And Kirk says that we can't have that, so he threatens to wipe out the entire planet if they don't stop killing their own people. But we can't have that happening, so Kirk had to step in. Story number 3 was Tomorrow is Yesterday. This was always one of my favorite episodes because that's the one where the Enterprise goes back in time to 1968 and is photographed by a jet as a UFO. And so they got to nip that in the bud. But that one has Captain Christopher in it as a character that as a 1968 guy watching the show, I always felt that Captain Christopher was a proxy for me, because he got to go and run around on the USS Enterprise and hang out with Kirk and Spock and everybody, and that's what I wanted to do. So this was a fun episode for me. Then the fourth story is Errand of Mercy. That's the first ever Klingon story, and Blish's version of that is pretty close to the episode as you probably remember it, with maybe the odd exception of some social biases that Blish writes into the nature of the Klingons, because it was written back in the day that Blish was writing these. I'll just leave it at that. And then the fifth story, Court Martial, that was a fascinating episode to me. Had some silly production issues in the episode, but the concept behind it, the premise of being able to edit a computer-generated record of things going on the ship, a computer-edited document of something that was going to be admissible in a trial. That just seemed so far out to me, that how could you ever edit something that was actually video recorded? And of course, now that's sort of a quaint notion that of course that's easily done now. We really have to worry about such a thing now. But that was a first for me watching that episode back in the day. And I think Blish's version of it is pretty accurate. Not so with the next story, Operation Annihilate. That one takes some huge differences from the way we remembered it in the episode. The whole story isn't even resolved at the planet Deneva, where it all happens in the TV episode. The Enterprise has to go something like 15 light years away, or is it 150 light years away? It's a long ways away in order to attack the central brain of this creature that is attacking all the colonists on Deneva. So that's a big story difference. But then another little kind of important canon difference is that in Blish's version here, probably based on a really early draft of the script, there is no relationship between Kirk and anybody on the planet. If you remember, that's the one that introduces Kirk's brother Sam and his sister-in-law and nephew, who are all attacked by the swarming of those creatures on Deneva. So there is no Sam Kirk in this story here. Then the next story, City on the Edge of Forever. This is one where Blish gives us a footnote at the beginning of the story, giving us the caveat that the script that he got for the episode was very different from the script that Harlan Ellison first wrote, which Ellison gave Blish to work from, apparently. And so Blish kind of did a little dance around that, because I'm sure he had to write it more along the lines of the script he was provided to write, and not the one that Ellison wanted. So he just says in his little footnote there that he took the best from both versions to create his adaptation here. And I think it's probably a lot closer to the version that we see on TV. There's some other things in Harlan Ellis's script that just went against some of Roddenberry's principles for how Starfleet would operate or would act in certain situations. And then also there were just some huge differences in the way that Ellison's script could even be produced for television on a weekly TV show budget. There was just no way. So, but the way the adaptation comes out in Star Trek II here seems very close to the episode we're familiar with on TV, versus the Operation Annihilate, which has a lot of big differences. Anyway, the final story in the book is Space Seed, which of course is the story that introduces us to Khan Noonien Singh, and had the great Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan sequel years later. Probably my favorite Star Trek movie of all time. And I wonder now that they're kind of retrofitting that timeline in Strange New Worlds, that could either of these episodes ever have happened now in the timeline as it's been adjusted. It just may live forever in this lost timeline of the original series in some weird way. I'm grappling with that. But anyway, that was the last story in the series there. Now, let's chat about the cover art for Star Trek II real quick here. And over the years, it's been reprinted a few times, but unlike Star Trek I, which came out in January of 1967, that got to use that great original artwork by James Bama, that artwork had been created originally to promote the TV series Star Trek before it premiered on NBC. So it was promotional artwork that Bantam got to use as existing art for Star Trek I. However, Star Trek II has a much plainer cover. They didn't have any original artwork to use, nor did they commission any. So instead, they just went with a publicity still, again from the studio, on a much plainer cover. However, Star Trek II, as it first appeared in February '68, did introduce that vertical slice down the middle, which then carried on through the rest of the initial James Blish series run, using that, like I say, that vertical sliver down the middle with the type, and then with the big display font number 2, number 3, 4, 5 on down the line as they went, which I always like that as a graphic approach to the covers. But this first one, as far as an image itself goes, they just used that publicity shot. And then in October '74, they updated the look of the cover a bit, but they still kept using that same publicity shot. So still kind of an uninteresting cover other than that vertical slice I was talking about. Then in August 1979, we got some actual illustration work, which is pretty cool, but we don't see any Star Trek characters in it or even the Enterprise itself anywhere. So it doesn't seem to illustrate any of the stories inside the collection, unless I guess you could make a case that it might represent the city on the edge of forever, because we do see a planetscape of a vast city in ruins, and that's pretty much the way Ellison's initial script described the city on the edge of forever, although we never really see anything like that in the final episode. Either way, there's really no use for that severe mountain peak in it. We don't know what that is. And that's because this wasn't artwork that was commissioned for Star Trek II. It was a pickup of artwork that was created for John Boyd's 1975 novel, Bernard's Planet. And the artist for this was Paul Lehr, who was a great science fiction artist of the time, but it just was not originally intended for Star Trek II. Again, they just kind of picked up existing artwork rather than commissioning anything new for this final reprint of Star Trek II, or at least one of the last reprints of Star Trek II. So now we can move on to the comic book Star Trek issue number 2 from Gold Key Comics, and we'll start by looking at its cover. Star Trek issue number 2 hit the comic racks on March 28th, 1968. That was just about a month or so after Blish's Star Trek II adaptation was published. And like Star Trek II, the comic book cover was pretty generic. It only used production stills and promotional shots of characters and of the Enterprise. So what we see a color production still of Spock from the Galileo 7 and an early publicity shot of Kirk with the laser rifle, I think it was called. I don't even think it was called a phaser rifle yet, from the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before. And then it has a black and white shot of everyone's favorite angle of the USS Enterprise against a field of clouds. Now, Gold Key Comics published a lot of titles based on studio TV shows and movies. And just to put Star Trek issue number 2 in context with a lot of the other comics on the newsstands of its day, let's take a look at other such titles that were out that same month as Star Trek II came out. These are the other studio-based gold keys that went on sale in the month of March 1968, along with Star Trek number 2. Now, all these comics, even though they came out in March, they usually had a cover date of June. And that was pretty typical in the comic industry, was to give their comics kind of a longer shelf life. But we can see here that a few of these were newer TV shows in 1968, just kind of getting their start as comics in the lower numbers, while titles like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., for instance, and The Three Stooges, they were already around for years at that time. Blackbeard's Ghost there, that was based on a current Disney movie that had just come out, so it was a one-off. It's kind of interesting to look back at these now all in a group and see a definite house style that was being used. I only collected Star Trek comics back in those days. I didn't get any of these other TV shows or movie comics here. But when I see them in context here now, you can really see that house style where they always used, they seem to always use publicity shots and production stills for their covers, regardless of what the story was inside. And then they had those big, bright, colored, crooked, rectangular boxes with a little descriptive copy in there describing the stories inside. And speaking of inside, Star Trek issue number 2, like Star Trek issue number 1, was written by Dick Wood and illustrated by Nevio Zecarra. So let's take a look at that. Here is the splash page to Star Trek number 2, which, kind of like DC Comics often did, this doesn't really start the story right off the bat here. It's more of like a little splash page intro trailer to the story that we are about to read. So it just kind of represents what we're going to get into here. And so as opposed to Star Trek number 1, the first issue, we're getting a little closer to some of accuracy as far as some of the colors and details. In the first issue, the artist Nevio Zecarra only had images of 4 of the characters. He had Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Yeoman Rand to go by, and a few exterior shots of the Enterprise. Everything else he had to make up. And we see a little bit of that still happening here now, and we'll see more of it as we get into the story. But we've got Kirk beaming down to the planet here. He's using his tricorder as a communicator, and then on his belt, he's got some kind of a hunting knife strapped on there, which is interesting. I don't know why they wouldn't have that, but they didn't. And then we're not seeing, well, I guess we are seeing, we're just seeing the green shirts here as opposed to the Command Gold, which I think the green shirts are actually more accurate to season 1 as they were intended to be filmed. It's just that the studio lights and bright lights as they were being filmed, that green velour reflected all the blue out of it, and so they just look gold or yellow. But we do see barely one guy there in a red shirt, which we did not see at all in the first issue, in that the entire crew wore green except for Mr. Spock, who wore his science blue. So as we get into the story, we'll start to see how Zecarra has a few more bits of images to work from, and in a lot of cases he's still making things up. So here we are with the first page of the actual story here, and the Enterprise still looks pretty good. Zecarra did have good reference of the USS Enterprise, and he drew it well, unlike other comic book artists in later years, I think, who had good reference of the Enterprise but just couldn't draw it very well. Zecarra did a good job, I think. He only had a few angles of the ship to look at and to draw from, and he used the same angles over and over again, but that was true even for the actual series on TV that we all saw over the years. Only had I forget how many exterior angles they had, but the 10 or less, I'm sure of that, and they used the same ones over and over again to great effect. So there you have it. Now, the writer, Dick Wood here, probably should have looked more often at his Star Trek Writer's Guide, because he's still, like he did in issue number 1, he's still writing about the Enterprise exploring another galaxy. This one is Galaxy Naboo. But be that as it may, as we look at some more of Zecarra's artwork here, he's getting closer and closer to some details. And in fact, he must have some reference of the interior of the bridge here, because we're getting down to the chairs actually starting to look correct. Those old George Jetson style chairs that they all sat in, that they'd always, well, sometimes sit in, more often they would fall out of them. But then in the last panel, though, he's still making some things up, because we see a communications officer there wearing headgear like an old submarine radioman there working sonar, and in fact, Kirk is even ordering him to raise the infrared periscope. Now, I wish we could have seen that exterior shot of the periscope rising up out of the middle of the bridge or something, whatever that might have been, but we don't get to see that. Now, in this next page, we get to see one of Zecarra's, I think, favorite angles of the Enterprise, a view from the top of the saucer, and it always looks great in his hand. But here we get to see the Enterprise getting kind of pulled into the electronic field of an asteroid of this system that they're exploring here. As they approach this system, there were a lot of asteroids floating around, and a number of them were glowing for some reason. So they went to investigate, and they're getting pulled into this not magnetic but electronic field that they can't break free from. And Spock is deducing that the source of that field must be on the planet itself. So of course now Kirk is going to order a landing party to go down and investigate it. Now they don't know that for sure, so how do they know where on the planet that source that they're only surmising would be? But it's only an asteroid, right? So it can't be that big, so let's just beam down and take our chances. Maybe we'll get lucky. So Kirk and 3 of his generic crewmen step not into the transporter booth, but into the teleportation chamber. And like in Star Trek issue number 1, Zecarra still doesn't have any good reference photos of the transporter room, but at least he's consistent. He's still drawing that same kind of transparent chamber booth that they're standing in there with those same kind of weird side projectors. We're not sure what those are, but we saw that in the first issue. So I still think that it's pretty convincing. If we weren't already familiar with the TV show set, and this was all I ever had to go by at the time I was reading this comic book, I would have bought that perfectly well. But as they beam down to the planet, they discover some machines that appear to provide supplies for somebody, but right away they've got company. And right away they get attacked by a horde of aliens that only have crude throwing weapons, and they're trying to protect their supplies. And that makes sense, so Kirk tries to establish a friendly stance and starts talking to the alien leader, Targu. And Targu explains that he and his people there are marooned. So Kirk says that they can take them off the planet and rescue them. But first, they have to find the source of the electronic field so that they can destroy it, allowing the Enterprise to break away from the asteroid. Now, as they explore further, they find a crashed ship here that they think must be Targu's crashed ship. But things don't add up, because when they look at the ship, it doesn't appear to be able to be piloted in any way. It looks like it was just, it just fell to the ground here somehow and it just crash landed. So they talk with Spock back on the ship and give him information so that Spock can start to analyze this data about this ship, whatever it might be. In the meantime, one of the other aliens, Lara, his name is, approaches Kirk to tell him that Targu has been lying to them. And the aliens, he explains, are actually condemned criminals from their home planet. And he tells the backstory of how once a month their government send convict missiles out into space to crash land on the glowing asteroids that are circling their sun. And they know that the glowing asteroids, don't know if these are natural asteroids or if they were engineered to do this, but the glowing asteroids at some unpredictable time, one by one, will explode, killing all of the convicts that have been living on that planet, and that is their form of capital punishment. So that craft that the landing party found was no pilotable ship of any kind. It was really just a craft to carry convicts from the home planet aimed at one of these glowing asteroids to crash land there where they can await their, I guess you'd call it, execution on that asteroid. Now, it's interesting in this issue, and it's never explained, but apparently there are 2 different races of alien here. You've got the big flat-nosed aliens with the giant ears like Targu and his men, and then you've got these other more spindly aliens like Lara with those kind of hooded ears and the kind of flute-nosed proboscis there. And we see just these two types throughout the comic. Usually the flat-nosed Targu types, those are the ones in control, in command. And then the little flute-nosed guys, they all seem to be kind of the subservient ones. Don't know if that's intentional or any kind of a statement that they're trying to make to us little kids back in those days. But and it's never mentioned, but we just notice it in the style of drawings. But now that Targu realizes his secret is out, he and his gang attack the landing party. And Zecarra gives us an interesting panel break at the top of the page here. There's no real reason for it. It's a continuous scene, but it's broken into two panels, I think, just for interest's sake. Meanwhile, back on the ship, Spock and Scotty are solving the problem of the energy field. Now, it seems odd that Dick Wood has Spock calling Scotty by his nickname. So, again, I think Mr. Wood needs to go back to his writer's guide. But they do manage to reverse the energy field, and the Enterprise is free now to move about. It's no longer stuck to that asteroid. At the top of another page, we get a glimpse of an unnamed lieutenant who I believe is supposed to be Uhura. It sure looks like her to me. I think that Zecarra finally got a photo of Nichelle Nichols to work from, but the colorist obviously didn't get the memo. But even with the photo reference, Zecarra still gives us a communications officer working at what looks like an old telephone switchboard. So there's that. He's still making up the sets as he needs to. But now that the ship itself is free, the landing party is not. They've somehow lost their phasers and are now captured by Targu and his goons with a simple net. But Kirk still has his tricorder, which in this comic book they call his radio. So Kirk can talk to Spock back on the ship. And apparently Spock could beam the landing party aboard, but Kirk says no, because the bad guys here are too close to them. They're trapped in their net, could be beamed away okay, but the transportation beam would also bring up Targu and his guys to run rampant on the ship. So Kirk says, no, don't beam us up yet, because they could somehow take over the ship. I don't know how, because even though the landing party has lost their phasers, isn't the ship full of security guys who can handle a few bad guys caught in a transporter booth? I would think so, but that doesn't seem to be the concern of the comic book. And then after a word from our sponsor, we come back to part 2 of the episode. And for some reason now, Targu has released the landing party from the net. And now that the Enterprise has been freed of the electronic field, it's also been able to complete its analysis of the asteroid. Now, sometimes this comic book calls it a planet, and sometimes it's an asteroid, back and forth. I believe it's supposed to be an asteroid, and when they've called it a planet, that was just an oversight. But it does bounce back and forth until the second part here, which is titled The Secret of Execution Asteroid, and Targu himself calls it Asteroid X. So it's an asteroid, but now Spock is able to inform Kirk that their scans have revealed that it's going to explode within 24 hours. So now the clock is ticking, and they've got to get off that asteroid. Now, I do like Zecarra's scenery. It looks barren and volcanic and inhospitable. I think he did a really good job with his scenery in this page. And on another page, he gives us a really nice piece of scenery in a bit of a flashback story here, where we're seeing the convicts in their early days on the asteroid, seeing a nearby asteroid exploding, so they can really now appreciate their dilemma and what their experience is going to be like eventually when they meet their own day of execution. So, with the clock ticking, Spock and Scotty need to get to work on a plan to rescue the landing party without beaming up any of Targu's guys to the ship. And apparently, Zecarra still hasn't gotten any reference photos of Jimmy Doohan, so he can only take his best guess at what Scotty should look like. And I don't think he comes very close here at all, other than the colorist pitching in with the red shirt. There's no reference photos for engineering either yet. So again, Zecarra invents what he needs here for his own engineering or whatever workshop they're working in there. Now, a few hours pass, and as dawn approaches on the asteroid below the ship, a rocket trail is seen in the sky. And Targu says that it must be another convict missile from the home planet, and so he and his minions run off to attack it so they can steal its food. Now that they know that the asteroid is going to blow up within the next day here sometime, they think they can steal the food from this new ship here, and at least they can have one last meal. Because with Targu, it's always first things first. But wait, it's a trap. It's really a fake convict missile built by Spock and Scotty based on Spock's analysis of that shipwreck that the landing party found earlier on. And so kind of a Trojan horse situation here. Scotty and his men are able to overpower Targu and his flunkies with fire bombs and rescue Kirk and the landing party. So now Kirk can safely order Spock to beam them all back to the ship, safe and sound. And while Kirk was gone, Kirk had put Spock in command of the ship while the landing party was captured. And so now Spock, once they're all back on the ship, Spock jokes that he enjoyed being captain so much, he may not pass command back to Kirk. And as they all enjoy Mr. Spock's little joke, Asteroid X explodes below them, killing everyone on the asteroid. And the end. So if I were to put myself back in time to the day that these comics were being published, I think I can forgive a lot of the inconsistencies and things. If you read them now for the first time, you're going to have problems with continuity and canon and all kinds of things like that. But looking back from a perspective of 1968, when we didn't have all that Star Trek canon baggage to deal with, I think that Nevio Zecarra in particular did a really good job in giving us a believable vision of Star Trek with just the few bits of accurate visual information that he had to work from, and then giving us all kinds of, I think, cool detail in things that he just had to make up. He was working in Italy, so he didn't have probably the access to watching the show like I believe Dick Wood did. I don't think the writer here, Dick Wood, was in Italy at the time. I believe he was probably here in the United States. So I don't give him as much latitude for not watching the show and getting the characterization closer. But that being said, the characters aren't really too far off in the comics. They're fairly basic. They're not developed much at all. So they can't go too far wrong. There's no relationships between the characters explored much at all. They're all just performing their very specific duty based on their rank and profile, I guess you'd say. But the only time it really breaks that is when they're given some kind of a mighty oath to say, like they might say, this isn't it, but jumping Jupiter or great Pluto or things like that nobody would say. That's all Dick Wood giving us that stuff. Other than that, the characters are not too far away from a basic accuracy, except for Spock's little joke there towards the end. That just doesn't seem right at all, and I put that on Dick Wood, who I believe by 1968 should have known better than to give logical Mr. Spock a joke to tell at the expense of a planet that's blowing up. But as far as that last scene goes there, this had a pretty grim ending there where an entire asteroid full of living, sentient, intelligent creatures are being destroyed, killed. And the ending of Star Trek issue number 1, where the Enterprise itself destroys an entire planet to keep evil spores from spreading any further, even though those evil spores were intelligent creatures with a civilization. And I think that's because Gold Key was one of the few comic companies that did not adhere to the Comics Code Authority. They didn't have it on there. So they could give us a little bit more grim storytelling than us kids were used to from other comic lines like DC and Marvel that we were reading back in the day. So there you have it, folks. Let me know what you think. Do you enjoy these old comic books? If you had a chance to read them at all, do you think they're cool or kind of corny, or what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below how you stand on those. And that's it. I'll let you go again for now. And one last time, I'd like to thank Vin at Revenant Reads for creating Book Trek. And another tip of the hat again to all of his co-hosts. And until we get a chance to chat again, thanks a lot.